He was the breakout star for the UFC in 2020. And though he had overcome some adversity this year, it looks as though Khamzat Chimaev is on the fast track to greatness in 2022. But just how much do you actually know about this hugely interesting backstory? Well, for this video, we're going to give you a deeper insight into this welterweight contender. These are 10 things you didn't know about Khamzat Chimaev. Number 10. No time to waste. A lot of combat sports athletes find their way to their chosen martial art as they reach at least some level of maturity. With many standout MMA stars having joined a gym in their early preteen years, Khamzat, on the other hand, began his wrestling training at just 5 years old, joining a junior wrestling program in his home of Chechnya that would eventually lead him to a life spent fighting. Seriously, for 22 years, this guy has been honing his talents, putting himself in uncomfortable positions both in competition and in training. But when you stop to think about it, it really does give you some insight into why he's such a handful when the cage doors close. When most kids are 5, they're playing with toys and perfecting the art of running in a straight line. Chimaev, at this point, was already beginning to learn the skills that would eventually catapult him to superstardom. To put it simply, this guy is just built differently. It's no wonder he's such a relentlessly exceptional fighter once the bout hits the mat. Khamzat has more or less dedicated his entire life to fighting. And as we all know, his results so far have well and truly backed it up. Number 9. A stellar background. Anyone who has watched Chimaev fight for even a minute will likely come to the conclusion that he must have a stellar background in wrestling. In 2016, 17, and 18, across 2 different divisions, Khamzat managed to bring home national wrestling titles, eventually garnering himself a reputation as one of the best wrestlers in the country. After a lifetime spent on the mats, it only makes sense that he is also now seen as one of the most offensively devastating wrestlers in mixed martial arts. Before his transition, Chimaev went 23-0 as a freestyle wrestler in Sweden before a recent victory over UFC middleweight and fellow Swede Jack Hermansson brought his perfect record to 24-0. That victory, like most of his contests, was incredibly dominant as he managed to win the bout by a score of 8-0. Hermansson, who is by no means a small middleweight, was left helplessly to Chimaev's extremely effective traditional technique, unable to mount much offense of his own. Number 8. His real name. Though we all know Khamzat by his chosen surname Chimaev, most of you probably don't know that his actual name is Khamzat Gariknov, the name he competed under during a large portion of his earliest years. Given his reputation on the wrestling mats as a child and later as a national champion in Sweden, a lot of his contemporaries in the wrestling scene would have known him by this name. However, as time went on, Khamzat decided to adopt the name Chimaev, which means Chechnyan Viking, as well as the nickname Borz, which of course means wolf. And yeah, we must admit, it's definitely got a certain ring to it, don't you think? Khamzat definitely looks like a warrior from the older times, and with a name like Chimaev, he's clearly stacking the deck in his favor. Number 7. A surprising source of inspiration. Though Khamzat would go on to make very public threats against his fellow UFC fighter Conor McGregor, which we'll get into in greater detail later in this video, most of you won't know the full story of Conor's indirect influence on Chimaev's MMA career. Seriously, as surprising as it might sound, Khamzat himself said that he was inspired to begin training in MMA after seeing McGregor knock out Jose Aldo back in 2015. However, before you start thinking that Borz is a fan, it was more of a "if that guy can do it, why can't I?" thought process than anything else. Chimaev is very clearly not a fan of the Irishman, but it still came as something of a shock to his fans that his path towards mixed martial arts was in some ways set in motion by his exposure to the man he would later make very public threats to. Had Jose Aldo won, would it be possible that he never made the moves that led him to the UFC? Maybe, maybe not, but all in all, the connection between Khamzat's fighting career and the divisive superstar that is Conor McGregor is a pretty odd one. Funny how that works, eh? Number 6. Multidivisional success. You'll obviously all know that Khamzat's UFC run has seen him compete at both 170 and 185 pounds. But what you might not know is that his pre-MMA days were also filled with multidivisional successes. Not only did Borz compete close to his natural weight in freestyle wrestling, but he also achieved national championship success as high as 202 pounds, or 92 kilograms. Some athletes stick to a conservative road to the top so they can manage risk and avoid any unexpected hiccups in their pursuit of success. If you hadn't guessed by now, maybe that will make it perfectly clear that Khamzat Chimaev has never been one of those guys. A total freak of nature who could well find himself in that exclusive group of dual-weight UFC world champions before too long. That said, with the pound-for-pound #1 Kamaru Usman in possession of the welterweight title, Chimaev will certainly have his hands full before he can start fully thinking about a move to middleweight once again. Remember, if you're enjoying our content and want to see more, be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Number 5. An early test. It might be easy to assume that Khamzat's early career run saw him taking a relatively easy road to the UFC, but in his time spent fighting in Brave CD, he definitely fought a pretty strong level of competition, all things considered. And during that time, by chance, he crossed paths with another hugely promising prospect, Ikram Aliskerov, a Sambo world champion who looks set to be another huge addition to the next wave of Dagestani talents to make moves in the top flight. In that fight, though it was short, saw Chimaev tested when his takedowns didn't initially work. Aliskerov is a pretty outstanding wrestler in his own right, and when he stuffed several of Khamzat's attempts, Borz was forced to improvise. Thankfully, Chimaev's stunning knockout power quickly came into play, and a beautifully timed uppercut knocked his opponent out cold. In this time since, Ikram has gone 3-0, proving that he's still very much a fighter worth keeping an eye on. And for Khamzat, this remains one of the more underrated victories on his resume. Number 4. High praise. Since making his transition over to mixed martial arts, Khamzat has been training in Sweden's All-Star Training Center, a place that sees him regularly sparring alongside the likes of David Tamor, Ilir Latifi, and most notably, the 3-time UFC light heavyweight title challenger, Alexander Gustafsson. Now, Gus obviously has been in there with some of the greatest fighters to ever lace up gloves, guys like John Jones, Daniel Cormier, Fabricio Verdum, and Glover Teixeira, to name a few. Back in 2019, before Khamzat was even close to his UFC debut, the press asked the Mauler about his talented gym mate, calling Chimaev one of the greatest fighters he had ever worked with. And when you consider the wealth of experience that Alexander brings to the table, it makes for a pretty hefty compliment, don't you think? Though he can certainly be abrasive to those who stand against him, Chimaev, by all accounts, is an excellent training partner, a humble, hard-working presence in the gym. When you consider his success and improvements over the years, it does make sense, doesn't it? Number 3. A brief holiday. One memorable tale from the recent MMA folklore comes in the form of Khamzat's attempt to enter the country of Ireland back in 2018 to find and beat up Conor McGregor for comments he made in the lead-up to his massive showdown with Khabib Nurmagomedov. McGregor, who managed to anger millions during that bout's fiery pre-fight press conference, seemingly did enough to spark a furious reaction from Chimaev, who was an amateur in MMA at the time. Upon landing in Dublin, Khamzat was initially passed through security before then being escorted to a cell shortly after. According to him, he was left there for 8 or 9 hours before being told to fly back to Sweden. Whether it's fully true or not, it's still a pretty hilarious piece of storytelling from the welterweight contender. Could you imagine what might have happened if he had, in fact, run into Conor and a group of his associates in the Irish capital? Perhaps it's best not to wonder how that might have played out. Number 2. A short notice debut. We all know the story of Khamzat's 3 opening fights within the UFC, how he broke records for both the quickest turnaround in UFC history and the fastest 3-fight win streak the promotion has ever known. But what many people forget about his opening appearance against John Phillips was that Khamzat stepped in on just 7 days' notice to make his UFC debut, replacing the injured Dusko Todorovic and answering the call when it came. On top of that, Chimaev was mainly fighting at 170 in MMA before this, dipping twice into the 185-pound pool in Brave CF. So when the time came to fight, he flew to Abu Dhabi with very little time to prepare, before taking on the powerful Welshman in a higher weight class under the biggest promotion in the world. Sure, everything that followed through his wins over Rhys McKee, Gerald Meerschaert, and most recently Li Jingliang was incredibly impressive in its own right. But the story behind the risk that came with Khamzat Chimaev's short-notice debut was just as intriguing in our books. Number 1. Performance Bonus King. And finally, we come to an interesting stat that you're likely not to find anywhere else. Though he has fought just 4 times under the UFC banner, Khamzat Chimaev has, of course, brought home 4 Performance of the Night bonuses. It makes sense, obviously, given that he has managed to run through each of his opponents without any real difficulty. What's crazy, however, is that Khamzat has already earned himself more post-fight bonuses than some of the most recognizable faces in the game. Champions like Petr Yan, Aljamain Sterling, and even Alexander Volkanovski. When you actually stop to think about that, with his relatively short UFC career in mind, it paints a pretty vivid picture of just how impressive he has been so far. We all know about his insane strike differential, landing hundreds on his 4 opponents while absorbing just 2, but with $200,000 in his back pocket from bonuses alone already, and superstardom clearly within his grasp, it's pretty safe to say that this one is an extremely special talent. With him edging even closer to title contention, it's pretty safe to say that we should expect to see this man continue to rack up UFC records in the very near future. And that will just about do it for this video. Again, if you enjoyed today's video and want to see more, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thanks for watching.